Hi, everybody. Uh, Hope this is recording. Um, I always say that because I always worry Zoom is going to let me down. All right, so we're starting week 2 of accident investigation. So this will be kind of covering some fundamentals, um, some basic concepts or definitions that you'll need to know as we kind of go forward and interact with things. At the end of the lecture, I will cover kind of some more detail about this week's assignment, so to speak. And we shall see how that goes. All right, so initially, what is an accident? The common definition generally accepted is an accident is the final event in an unplanned series of unique events that results in an injury or illness to an employee and may include property damage. It is the final result or effect of a number of surface and root causes. Surface causes you occasionally will also see referred to as apparent causes. Um, that's actually one of the topics of this lecture will be essentially how the terminology and some of the basic applications shift throughout accident investigation. But there's the core components. So, and they're the bolded items here. So you have to have an event. It has to be unplanned, some injury or illness, and to an employee. The reason that those are specifically called out essentially is, when we consider an event, what is an event? An event is fundamentally an action that has some various causes or can be traced back in some way. What does unplanned contribute? So when we say something needs to be unplanned, what are we thinking? Why does it have to be unplanned or unintentional? Injury or illness matters. Why is that a key component of an accident? And at least in this definition, they specify employee. Why do we care about the employee in that instance? And here are kind of the more accepted definitions, I would say. So an event is comprised of an actor that's supposed to be performing an action. The actor does not have to be a human actor. It is just some thing taking on action. Unintentionality is generally considered necessary for an accident. It seems illogical that there would be planned accidents, but there's some nuance there that we'll get into. And injury or illness matters. Why? Impact is why that matters. No harm, no foul. Or if you are taking an especially conservative safety posture, is there always some foul, whether there was harm or not? If you break the rules, but nothing happened, you still broke the rules, kind of thing. But at the end of the day, an accident has to have an impact that's tangible. And why is employee specific? Because whatever that impact is, it has to be an impact to someone or something that matters or that has some inherent value. That's property damage or systems get involved there too. Impact to those is still can be considered an accident. Now, this is one of my favorites or just weird things that occasionally you'll come across is some different methods or regulators or anything might specify accidents versus incidents. So if accidents require some injury, incidents are when the completion of a task is adversely impacted, but there is no injury. Just for your information. So maybe on the last slide, the no harm, no foul, you broke the rules or did something unsafe, but there was no accident or there was no injury or impact. So that is an incident. To me, it always just seemed like bureaucratic nitpicking that doesn't really matter. And if anything, just serves to undermine accident investigation efforts. So take it either way. I just wanted to specify that because I know it can get confusing if you run up against that. Now, when we consider types of accidents, depending on the resource or the source you're using, some methods will specify, some granularity specificity, like you were struck by something or you struck something. Those are different types of accidents, or, um, there was some chemical or biological component, or they really get down in the dirt. I would say, if you're, we'll get into this a little bit more, but you always want to be respectful of the space you're working in. So if, hypothetically, if this was an accident investigation taking place in an NTSB jurisdiction or environment, then you should adhere somewhat to whatever the NTSB wants you to do. And if they like some level of granularity beyond just these common examples here, then you want to stick with that. But for this, I didn't want to communicate the entire gamut of definitions. I think we're fairly, we can suss out the nuance of you struck something or something struck you. But these are the big ones. So injury, illness, damage, failure, and then I'm asking you guys if there's any other examples that don't fall into this that maybe we missed. So an injury is obviously an injury to person or property. Injury to people is pretty understandable. Injury to property can be somewhat tricky depending on the circumstance and the application you're in. Obviously, injury to property is readily apparent in an instance like a crash of some kind where you mangled steel and those things is pretty apparent. But what if there's something that's a little bit more minor that undermines like concrete or something over time? We think about this a lot with pollution. Those injuries may not be as immediately apparent. Illness, obviously, systems can't get sick, but for people, that's a big one that we specify, especially for chemical and biological. There are specific legal differences between injuries and illnesses that you need to be aware of, relevant to your scope or application. Damage, injury to property and damage could be, interchangeable given different situations. To me, damage has always been kind of on that first example, things that are immediately apparent and visual or sensory changes to some system or material, where injuries might be a little bit more on the subtle side. But that's just kind of my own take on it. But it could be kind of, you might have your own as well. Failures. So failures are a specific case, usually of systems. So because I'm coming from a nuclear background, nuclear power has a lot of instances of system failures where there may not be damage to various systems because of safety protocols or automatic safety systems or functions, but the failure itself is still something that is monitored and managed. So be aware of that as a potential work scope thing as well. Now back to the work scope or application space, you definitely want to keep in mind what the big hitters are in this world, right? So the relevant regulators or regulations might come from OSHA, the Occupational Safety, Health and Health Administration. Especially if it's a workplace event, they will get involved. NTSB stands for the National Traffic Safety Board. That is who will cover plane crashes, train events, vehicle crashes, those kind of things. The FMCSA is a kind of specific one, but I wanted to mention it. This is for interstate trucking generally, or essentially kind of all cargo hauling on land. So that's the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration. They take, when we think truck drivers have specific hours that they can drive and those kind of things. Those are governed by the FMCSA. The FDA has their own regulations. You know, if it's an accident investigation that's pertaining to a laboratory or some kind of a agricultural environment, for example, the FDA may have some standards there. The National Safety Council is one. It's kind of more of an NGO, but it will provide regulations or advisement documents, those kind of things. In recent years, law enforcement investigations have become more of a kind of focus, or just more in our general consciousness or zeitgeist. And so, you know, there's a lot of questions there of, you know, when there's an incident involving law enforcement, how does that apply in an accident investigation space? You know, that's a relatively, I don't think it's necessarily relatively new, but the formalization is probably relatively recent, considering the just scale of these law enforcement organizations, you know, that have grown over the years, and now they are massive organizations. So you have to have some kind of a defined process to follow there. And the last one is kind of it's an external, almost like a certifying body, but also they cover a lot of ergonomics and workplace safety matters. So it's an important one to know of is NIOSH, which is the National Institute of Occupational Safety and Health. They will cover, you know, those of you in human factors that have taken ergonomics might be familiar with NIOSH calculators for lifting and some of those ergonomic restrictions or anthropometric measurements. There might be others as well out there, but it's something to be aware of, especially if you're looking for resources. These are the big ones that I would recommend starting with. And ultimately, whatever accident investigation space you are in will largely govern the methods and tools that will be acceptable in that space. So that's why, like I said last week, we're not going to cover, this isn't a class on OSHA methods or NTSB or NASA or any of that. This is just about the fundamentals of what makes an accident investigation and what's involved. And then there will be nuances in each application space. So I wanted to specifically get into a question. So one thing you'll notice as we go through the class, I'm going to put a lot of weird questions on you that might be kind of unique for some of you or some of these topics. But I really want you to think about these things in what I would refer to as first principles. So what are the fundamental or foundational constructs that we're really talking about here? That especially will help you in accident investigations, as they are generally very messy and involve many different variables. And keeping your eye on what guides those foundational principles will help you as you kind of move through the accident investigation process. So why do we have regulations? That's really a huge question. And as you all go through your case studies of each of the accidents and events that you chose, you will see that some areas have more regulations than others. Regulation may have, usually I would say, not even just occasionally, in general, you will see regulations either begin or increase or decrease or end surrounding an accident. There are definitely some instances why regulations may be a causal factor for accidents. Over regulation or regulating certain things versus the lack of regulation could also be. But it's important to kind of consider this of why are they relevant? So why do we regulate safety? And why is safety deemed an important societal function? We all kind of take that one for granted there. So why? There are capitalistic reasons. There's value to keeping equipment, or, you know, in the cold calculus, let's say, of just the resources of a capital enterprise, your human workers, there is a financial or fiduciary reason to keep them in the most efficient state as possible. And then we talk about the fundamental power of government. So a lot of these governmental regulations are the only places that these can come from. Self-regulation of large organizations or entities or groups generally has not been successful. There are human psychological reasons for that, but in general, we all kind of accept and part of the social structure, the social contract, that the government is the central power that can investigate and enforce these things. And lastly, we deem others' well-being as important. So even beyond whatever utilitarian reasons we might have for these things, we want people to be okay. We want people to make it home at the end of the day, or those instances. That's an important thing to consider too, of why we value these things. And this next one's also a we take it for granted question. Are we entitled to safety? This is an interesting question that, it can bounce down political lines. It doesn't necessarily have to. It's just a question. Are we? And in what ways? In the workplace? Out in public, just walking around town? Or in our homes? In terms of like the homes, the private areas of our life, there's an expectation, right, that our domiciles are built in accordance with various building codes. Why? So that they are safe to inhabit. And what is it about safety that makes it something we are entitled to? And that's a question I want you all to consider. So going back to intentionality, so we said, there are no planned accidents. I want you to consider, what does it mean if something is intentional or unintentional? We talk about sometimes we will get into human error pretty thickly in a few weeks, I think, but human errors are the generally accepted definitions are they're fundamentally unintentional actions, which from like a psychological or human factors perspective makes studying them extremely difficult. How do you in a controlled environment, in a controlled experiment, initiate an unintentional action? And if it's unintentional, fundamentally, the definition of that is that it doesn't have thought or planning behind it. So then how can we expect somebody to be able to understand why they did an unintentional act? And when we talk about this from an accident investigation, an interesting intentional versus unintentional case study might be, what about accidents that come about as a result of tolerating or ignoring an unsafe condition? Is that unintentional? And a key question of every single accident is, when do the impacts of an action begin and end? Because we could follow a chain of causation all the way back to when we were born, probably, but that's not practical or realistic. But in this instance of tolerating or ignoring an unsafe condition, I expect several of you, if not each of you, will see this in those case studies where people knew of a problem, it was tolerated or ignored. So does that mean the accident was unintentional because we intentionally tolerated it or ignored it? Given that, if somebody makes a faulty risk perception or risk judgment, are they accountable for those impacts from there as they would an intentional act? How do we approach that? And the big point here that I just want you guys to consider is that the context of the accident matters. There are contexts to every aspect of an accident. We think about each of the accidents that were chosen were large national or international events, and there are other things at play there, political, societal, economic forces, and contexts, the way these stories are told. All of that is still important as we consider these accidents. And in some instances, it can matter more than the root cause. I suspect whoever chose the Columbia disaster will see some instances, some characteristics of NASA and the context that surrounded NASA at that time uh, were extremely potent and had a lot of impact. And that's going to be an interesting thing for you guys to explore. Next, we're moving into causation. So I think, like I said in my introduction, I have a philosophy degree. You really don't need to get into the philosophical notions of causation. It could drive you mad, but we still want to think about this. We don't want to just accept what, cause and events or cause and effect on just that base level. We want to dig in a little bit more. So when you say X caused Y, what are we saying? A lot of people don't ever think about this, but fundamentally what you're saying is that Y, and in an accident investigation, we're talking about a timeline or a chronology. If X caused Y, X had to come before Y, because that's the way time works. But what that means is that what I tend to refer to as world states, whatever world state Y occurred in, would not fundamentally exist without X. So there's a necessity there usually, if we're talking about a specific cause. And that's really, really important when we get into root causes and what the impact of a root cause is. But I want you all to consider that aspect, and especially as you're reading through your case studies, are there other causal factors that weren't as inextricably linked as this? Like, oh yeah, they were there, but they weren't necessarily as potent of a cause. And I want you to consider why and be able to identify those things. Cause confused with blame. So this is a big one in accident investigation. Some people will approach accident investigation as almost as a criminal investigation. We have to get our killer or our thief or whatever it is. And that's not really the purpose of accident investigations. Accident investigations, there was a time that it was. Accident investigations in the more modern years, the last few decades, specifically pushed by Sidney Decker's work in safety culture and just culture, which we'll get into in a few weeks, have changed that to where, as an accident investigator, your role is not to find who to blame or who was at fault. Your role is to find the root cause. And one of the biggest things that I want you all to remember, because if you propose it in a case study, I will call you out on it. As a general rule, and it's even stronger than a general rule, as an almost always 99.9% of the time rule, if you say human error is the root cause, you did not go deep enough. So there is something else at play. That is mainly grounded on the notion that we expect human agents to be effective and to work well in their situations. There's a saying, nobody comes to work to mess up that day. So it's something to consider. Another one that you'll see a lot is common sense. And I just want to throw this out there so that we're all on the same page here, especially from a psychological perspective. Common sense is not a thing. There's no such thing as common sense. Every single person's knowledge and thought process, their cognitive processes, are the very specific result of their circumstances, their perceptions, their experiences, and their knowledge. There can be commonly accepted knowledge, or there can be commonly accepted knowledge. A red light means stop. That's not common sense. If you were never taught that, you would not know that. There's nothing about the inherent redness of a thing that makes stop the apropos response there. If you think that there is, especially with the red and green thing, I would just like to point you to nuclear power, where green usually means that something is off or in a steady state. Red means it is on and moving. So it's important for you to consider that there. A lot of times there will be pressure to, well, so-and-so doesn't have any common sense, or that's just common sense. There's no such thing. There just isn't. And I want you guys to remember that. And traditional causation. So this is what I would say, traditional in the sense of it was more common decades ago, and it's just not been very, very relied on in the last 10 to 20 years. There was an increased focus on the worker, not the organization. This is where we get the blame and fault cultures and dilemmas. And the machines were never or almost never at fault. The notion here was that machines can't have fault. They don't possess whatever characteristic makes them blameworthy in those things, which is, again, part of the problem. Machine may be a cause, but yeah, you can't really blame it. There's something fundamentally different there. And this has mostly given way the last decade or two to systems causation. So systems causation considers that everything serves a role in a system. We see this with ecosystems, or organizations are a big system with various pieces. The human workers may be part of the system. The office supplies are part of a system, the printers. I mean, so causation becomes muddied and tangled in some of these aspects. So if we're talking about systems causation, what are the characteristics of a system? And so as we consider that, those characteristics will likely be inherited by the notion of systems causation. So there are many factors or variables in a system, interdependency of components. So people may be dependent on people, on tools, on equipment, etc. And causal factors could be in many places and often are nearly everywhere. And this is important to understand. This is what leads to these wonderful error messages I've showed up here, where, okay, something went wrong. Thanks. That's super helpful. It's because they don't often know what went wrong. They just know that for whatever reason, the sun, the moon, and the stars of that system did not align. And that's an important thing to consider. So from our perspective in accident investigation, and using systems causation as our kind of guiding principle there, again, we're fixing the system, not blaming. That is not the focus there. As investigators, we have to untangle the situation and find the root cause. And corrective actions, which are usually the actions taken to mitigate or correct those errors, should serve to repair the system flaws and design a solution which will prevent another occurrence. This is when we get to root causes, so that X causes Y. X is fundamentally necessary for Y to exist. That's a root cause. So root causes, if eliminated or corrected, that accident will never occur again in those specific configurations. Doesn't mean a similar one won't, but if you did it correctly and the correction was made, it's also the big factor here, right? And adhere to, then it should not. Which I love that. I always have loved this picture. I have kind of an IT background, and so I've seen some pretty messy cable rooms or dial rooms where just the cable management's pretty brutal. And so that's what I always think about with accident investigations, is you're essentially needing to connect like for like, but you have to dig it out of this big pile first. So some definitional stuff, just to kind of keep these terms in your mind. Root cause, we've already covered. The fundamental cause or causal factor that will prevent recurrence if it's corrected. A causal factor is just a factor that shaped the outcome of the situation. It's not another cause, it's a causal factor. So it's something, some characteristic or contextual or environmental thing that surrounds a cause. We might think of it as the atmosphere, the environment that allows the cause to thrive. Extent of condition, this is actually one that may not be as relevant in certain application spaces. It is in a lot of large scale industrial situations, nuclear, but it's essentially when you have detected a faulty condition or a troublesome condition that could lead, that impacted your accident, and you perform an additional analysis to figure out when or in what instances that condition exists elsewhere in the organization or process. It's a way to, again, mitigate future errors by hopefully trying to find other instances of the same mistake. Barriers or controls. Barriers are a huge part of accident investigation. When we get into the different tools, there's actually a tool for barrier analysis that'll be really, really important. So those barriers, a barrier fundamentally is a physical or administrative control. Let me do this. A physical or administrative control designed to promote consistent performance and defend against inappropriate actions. We'll get into that a little bit more in a couple slides, but the barriers are how we try to prevent improper actions or mistakes or those things. We try to help those things. These could be your warning labels, all the way up to a key card to a dangerous environment or a key card swipe. Corrective actions are measures to correct issues of quality. They will likely follow your accident investigation. And an extent of cause is an extent of condition with a twist that makes it generally pretty difficult to do, but it's something I just want you aware of. So where else is the root cause present, or does it have a potential to be present? So an extent of condition might help you identify your extent of cause, but it's a broader perspective of, okay, this root cause that allowed this event to occur, where else does this root cause make a play? If the root cause is a poorly designed system, or let's say a poorly designed interface, for example, a specific one. Okay, does that design pattern exist in any other interface? Is that something we need to be aware of? And so but that also could be an extent of condition in some ways too. So it's really kind of muddy in that sense of how they connect, but there is definitely a link there. So the steps in an investigation process. So per OSHA, I pulled this out of an OSHA Guide to Incident Investigation. This is really involved. This is, I would say, one of the more detailed ones I think I've ever seen. I won't bore you with reading through each of them, but especially if your event chosen is a workplace incident or has workplace characteristics, definitely this might help you kind of orient yourself to what they did. But there's some specific things like obtain the investigation kit. Some large organizations or regulators will prescribe these pieces, which end up trying to formalize and make this process kind of unified across a range of different instances. So everybody who does an investigation fills out these cards or these forms. That way we can look across accidents and be oriented in that area. Securing the area, that's a pretty common one that you'll see, and we'll go into kind of what I would say the more common steps are, but I wanted this to be aware, something you guys were aware of there. Documenting the scene is important, completing the report. And because this is OSHA, they're looking at improvements over time, not just prevention. And then, but this last one, number 9, is extremely important and is often why most accidents recur. Is correct. Everything was done correctly in the investigation, but the follow-up on those corrective actions was not done appropriately or was not completed well or timely. And that is the number one reason probably that accidents recur. The more common steps, I would say, are you need to secure the accident scene. document an accident scene, documenting the scene as drawings, pictures, the CSI-ification of something that we've seen in procedural police dramas. Conducting different interviews of the relevant parties. This could be the victim or specific agent who we've identified, the pilot of the plane or etc., those kind of things. But also tangential people, other members of the crew or organizational members. You kind of follow that as it goes. You then develop the sequence of events. This is a critical step and is often one that you want to make sure you involve as many people of the team as possible so you can get to a commonly accepted series of events and not miss anything. Because this will guide the tools you use in the next steps. Then you would conduct apparent and root cause analysis. Recall apparent cause could also be referred to as surface causes. You will determine the solutions. Those are your corrective actions or mitigations that you're recommending, and then communicate. This is writing up the report or all of those instances that come after all of those. The one on the right is just another, the image on the right, there's just another take on it. An immediate action, the reason I put this in here is essentially the immediate action. So immediate actions if we're relating it to the text on the left, would be the securing the accident scene. A lot of times in industrial situations, we talk about putting things in a safe condition. That should always be the immediate thing that you do. For example, if something happens and let's say a valve was opened and you've got this caustic chemical spraying everywhere, you should shut that valve. You don't need the valve open to do anything. So that's putting something in a safe condition so you can move forward. But that was the big one that I wanted for the other instance. Some of these accident investigations don't really talk about immediate actions, but immediate actions are very, very important. Again, we've talked about the different application spaces, making sure you refer to whatever entity has jurisdiction, adhere to whatever the processes are and the application space. But I wanted you all to keep in mind that regardless of whatever system you're working under, the goal is to find the cause, not the blame. And these are two of my favorite examples of weird government bureaucratic decision-making and just headlines that make me laugh. So keep that in mind, though, that you do need to work within that regulator's bounds, but obviously you want to make sure you're pursuing the goal appropriately. And now I want to start getting into kind of some concepts around accident investigations and honestly more before the accident. So when we talk about designing these systems or processes, so resilience versus fragility. So when you talk about these things, what does resilience mean? I put the Sisyphus comic here because sometimes that's referred to as resilience because he continues to push the rock up the hill. But what do we think of when we think of organizations or processes? To me, resilience is being able to continue a process or a task in light of adversity or different circumstances. So if that's what resilience is, fragility is the opposite. So what do we think about with fragility? So two recent examples are the Texas grid failures, one this summer and then last winter, were both instances of fragility, instances of certain situations causing issues in these processes or systems that probably should have been planned for. I mean, the Texas thing's a bit unique because obviously we're in a lot of areas of the country, we're experiencing different weather and climate issues than we'd had before, but those are some concerns. California's rolling blackouts are one of the biggest ones for me, though. The fact that PG&E has to turn off power so that old failing equipment does not cause forest fires or wildfires in that instance. That's a huge example of fragility. That system is fragile. It does not take much to push it over or to break it. Now, a separate example on the other side of resilience, it could be nuclear power safety systems. So nuclear power, especially since the events of the 70s and 80s, has become extraordinarily resilient. Even in the Texas grid instance, there was a nuclear power plant that went offline because one of its turbine decks was exposed to the elements and there was some line freezing. But at no point was the plant at any risk of failure or accident or risk of leaking radiation out into the populace, because there are safety systems built on top of safety systems. The nuclear industry learned a lot from Chernobyl and 3 Mile Island and recently Fukushima, and have been responding to make that more resilient. So my last question here is, are all accidents a sign of some fragility? And that's a question for you all. Resilient systems can still fail. There can still be issues. So what are we thinking there? Oh, wow, this came out really bad. I will share in the Slack this image because this is, I didn't think this looked a lot better when it was just on my local PowerPoint. Anyway, so the Swiss cheese model is an example of what I would say barriers, going back to that. So it was pioneered by James Reason, who is a big, was a big writer in human factors and error for a while. He suggested and kind of pushed the symptomatic or disease model of human error. So he treated human error as the end result of symptoms. So the idea was, if you could fix the symptoms, you could fix the disease of human error. So through design or different aspects, can we make human error less likely, similarly to how we would versus a disease? This is a recent favorite example of the Swiss cheese model is the Swiss cheese respiratory virus pandemic defense. Because of this COVID situation we're all living through, there are different barriers. And according to Reason, you get human error when the holes in the Swiss cheese all line up. Because the idea is you might, an instance might get past a few of the barriers, but then another one will stop it. This is what we think of when we think of resiliency and layered defense. And I'm really bummed out. I love this graphic. So for this week's assignment, I kind of prompted it a little bit in the Slack, but just so you have some more definition here. So begin to read about your chosen event and post what you learn. So you don't have to go out and read the hundreds of pages of reports that are out there. Just start to get oriented or acquainted with your event, get your who, what, when, where, why, and how lined out, and post it in the Slack. Especially these questions. You don't have to answer these questions necessarily, but they're just meant to kind of make you think, is there anything weird or surprising? What was the issue known prior to the accident? This is when we get into those tolerated conditions. What were some of the challenges of the accident investigation process? So a very practical one in a lot of these is weather. It's very, very hard to investigate an accidental crash or something in the rain. Your evidence may be degrading every second. What are those challenges? Organizational pressures. It's also where we get into the context of the accident investigation and how does that affect it. Then I want you guys to message me on Slack which accident you want to do for the initial case study and which will be your second. If you're not sure yet, because you're still just kind of getting your feet wet with the accidents, tell me that. Just tell me you're not sure. You don't have to pick one right now, but if you do, it just helps me plan out. I'll probably expect you to know for sure in the next couple weeks. But if you do know that, hey, okay, I'm going to focus on this event and then I'm going to focus on this one. Um, that's kind of the goal there. And lastly, reach out if you're not sure where to start with your event or where to find the reports. So in general, a lot of these events, especially the ones that were chosen, there was a mix of modern and old, but in general, so they trend towards the older ones. And those reports should be out and publicly available just from a Google or however you want to find your uh, resources there. The Wikipedia references section or whatever works for you. But if you aren't sure or you don't have access to it or you can't find a good one or something, let me know. Because sometimes I might have them or I might know where to find them. And a pro tip, just if you haven't ever experienced it, if Google isn't giving you anything, try the university library search. So the library access to journals and to various databases can be really helpful over just a Google search sometimes, especially if some of these reports or write-ups are stuck behind a paywall or you need access. And like I said, reach out to me as well. I have a few different access platforms that I can try to use to find you stuff if you need. So and that's all for this week's lecture. I'm hoping to engage more on Slack this week. So, post things, questions, just if you've had any thoughts over the last week, and we can kind of try to get some dialogues going. So, that's it. I hope you guys have a great rest of the week. Again, sorry this was a day late, but next week should be a little bit easier to keep that schedule for you guys. So, yeah, looking forward to read your messages. Thanks.